Okay, well, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Terry. I've been in the Institute for 6 years, and I know I gave a talk a couple of months ago, but it wasn't really my talk. I gave it because of talking to Ilya and Johanna about AI. And then Tali was supposed to give a talk today, but she wasn't quite ready, and I wanted to give a talk about something that I've been thinking about, so I decided to do it. So this is some stuff that I've been thinking about on and off for at least 15 or 20 years, maybe 30 years, thinking about sporadically. It's not like I've been doing full-time thinking. And so I thought I would try to get my thoughts organized and give a talk. And I had to come up with a title, so this is what I came up with, and I'll explain the image in a minute. Okay, so I like thinking about evolution and reading about evolution, and this is one of the many books that I've read over the years. Ernst Mayr is a very famous ecologist. He actually was into birds. He wrote a very big, thick book about the growth of biological thought. In a way, this talk is about the growth of my biological thought. And my PhD thesis was about evolutionary algorithms of fitness landscapes and so on. I also made a company that I will mention very briefly at the end, which somehow is related. And I realized that a lot of my life has revolved around this kind of thinking. And one of the things that I've thought about over the years is that some thinking about biology doesn't feel right to me. And I'm going to give you some examples of it at a very high level. It doesn't smell right in some way. One of the problems is that a lot of the language that we use when we talk about biology comes from the 19th century or even earlier. And there was no knowledge of the microscopic world at that time, or those times when we started looking around and we saw these organisms of different kinds and they were macroscopic, and people came up with ideas about where they came from, or often it was just because they came from God, and they came up with unusual explanations for things because they couldn't see the connections, and we didn't have DNA and all those sorts of things. And as a result, I think a lot of the language is a bit wrong in some way. So for example, I think the idea that there's such a thing as an individual is just wrong. There's no such thing as an individual, and therefore things like talking about fitness of individuals, it also doesn't make sense. And if you think you're an individual, then you should tell that to the majority of bacterial cells that are hanging out in your large intestine, and so on. So I don't think anything is really an individual. Anyway, there's awkwardness at the big scale and also at the small scale, and I'm going to illustrate that a little bit. So one of the things that occurred to me over the years was that if you think about biology and you have these sort of basic theories or fundamental theories about what's going on in biology, then they should work at the low levels. If they're correct, they should be right at the low level, and they should only run into problems when you get to bigger things like humans and lecture halls and Netflix and stuff like that. And it shouldn't be the other way around, right? It should be that things work at the little level, and then maybe they get awkward or hard to apply when you get to the more complex level, not the other way around. And the reason that the other way around is because of this old biological thought where we saw individuals and we came up with theories about individuals, and then when we discovered the microscopic world, the stuff about big individuals didn't necessarily apply to the lower levels. So I think that historical trajectory of thought is a little bit flawed, just because we didn't know about the microscopic world. And you should be able to think about the microscopic world and go up. And then another thing that happens is that as you go up, let's call it up, it doesn't matter what you call it really, it shouldn't be that what you think about biology breaks down when you get to the man-made level or the human-made or the person-made level. But if you look at a lot of thought about biology and you look at like the hierarchy of biology and so on, all the images that you see, or almost all of them, they kind of stop. Maybe they get to ecosystem and so on, but they don't include things that humans build. For example, they go, oh, that's man-made, that's not natural. But that's kind of stupid because everything is natural. I mean, everything like this is a product of things that was built by biological creatures. So these things made me sort of uncomfortable a little bit with some of the biological thinking. Okay, so I'm going to make a little bit of a segue and talk about this guy. This is the only virology in the whole talk. Salvador Luria is a very famous virologist. Who's heard of Salvador Luria? There we go, one or two people. He won the Nobel Prize in 1969. He worked with Delbruck. So yeah, they did a lot of stuff on the replication, genetic structure of viruses, a lot of work on phages. His first graduate student was James Watson. He was actually at the university that I was at in the US, so I lived somewhere near him, but 50 years later. And he and some other guy, they also discovered restriction enzymes. So Luria, he did a lot of things that were very consequential. And he wrote a book, which I have a copy of. I've actually got the second edition, not the first. It's called General Virology. It's very nice. And if you read Principles of Virology, which is what we did in our group, at the very beginning of that book, it quotes Luria's book. And this is the thing from the preface. And I'm going to read it, even though I know you can all read. It says, there's an intrinsic simplicity of nature. The ultimate contribution of science resides in the discovery of unifying and simplifying generalizations rather than the description of isolated situations. So he's saying, can we find general ways of looking at biology that are different from going down into the rabbit hole of, looking at one particular thing and describing that and so on and so forth. And then he repeats himself, which is what I do quite often. He says, in the visualization of simple overall patterns rather than the analysis of patchworks. And then you might say, well, what does simple mean? Simple to whom, or to who, as I would say. Does it mean simple to someone who studies biochemistry or to a theoretical physicist? Or does it mean simple to the person in the street or someone that you bump into on the bus? And I'm going to talk about something today which I think is simple to the people on the bus, and it's about biology. Okay, anyway, for me this is a bit inspiring because these ideas that I'm going to talk about, I find them a bit too simple and even maybe boring and not even worth talking about. But then you see things like this and you think, well, maybe it is worth talking about. I don't really know. Okay, so I'm going to talk about something that I call the asynchronous principle, which is a bit of a pompous word, I think. And what I mean by that is that the principle is that if you can take a synchronous system and you can replace it with an asynchronous one, then things turn out well. It's generally a very good thing to do, but you've got to figure out how to make the asynchronous system, and then you've got to build it, and then you have to maintain it. So there's a cost. I'm going to explain what this slide means in a minute. And I'm calling it a principle because I don't know what else to call it. I could just call it a trick. But it's just a thing which is just there. If you can do it, it works really well. Or I could call it something that can often be tried, and if you manage to do it, things tend to work out well. But that's a bit of a mouthful, so I just decided to call it a principle. And what does this mean? Okay, today I'm gonna give you, it's like a talk in 2 acts. The first act is just some simple explanation and examples from the human world and the kinds of things that we do. And then I'm going to talk about the rest of biology. And I'm a fan of Samuel Beckett, and here's one of his plays, which is an act in 2 parts, a play in 2 acts. Okay, so what do I mean by synchronous interactions? If this is confusing to people, I don't know, it's a pretty normal word in some way. In a synchronous interaction, you have parties that are involved, and they have to be involved at the same time. They don't necessarily have to be in the same place as we are today, but often they are. But you can also be remote. You could be on a Zoom call together, and that's a synchronous interaction. And there's many, many examples. So for example, if you go to the market with a sack of potatoes and you want to swap your potatoes for someone who grows beans on their farms, you find the person who's got the beans, you negotiate a bit, and then you do the swap. That's a synchronous interaction. You're in the same place at the same time. Handshakes and hugs. I put a hug in there because some people like hugging. They're synchronous. Or catching a flight. You go to the airport, you've got to be there at the right time when the plane is going to leave, otherwise you miss the plane. You can't just show up at any point. With TV shows, it used to be on television, when I was a kid, you would look at the program and a show would be on at 5:30 p.m. on Channel 7 or whatever, and you had to turn the TV on at 5:30 and go to Channel 7 and watch it. That was a synchronous experience. You couldn't just watch it when you felt like it. You had to be there at the right time. So there's many examples, and there's a lot of them that are in communication. As I've just mentioned, some telephone calls, so on and so forth, or when two ships are flashing a signal to each other, which they used to do at sea with a light to send a message, or a particularly stupid one is the bat signal in Gotham City, where they need to be saved by the superhero, so they have a brilliant idea of, hoping that it's a cloudy night and then putting a sign up in the sky and hoping that Batman is looking out the window and not in the bath, and that he comes running. So this is a really stupid example of a synchronous communication method, especially if there's an emergency. Okay, so what's the alternative? With asynchronous interactions, the parties don't have to be involved at the same time. Basically, you have a choice about things. And this slide is the same as the last one, but I'm going to illustrate a couple of these things. Like there is an alternative to turning up at the market and exchanging goods in a synchronous way. I'm going to get to it in a minute. It's pretty obvious. There's alternatives to telephone calls where the other person has to be there. There's obviously alternatives to people like a parent teaching a child a song. And by way of illustration, I'm just going to show you some pictures. So this, for example, you may have never thought about, but this is asynchronous messaging. Instead of standing on the corner and stopping people and saying, hey, I made this really cool drink, you should try it, and so on, you just put up a sign. It's very effective. People drive by it on the highway, or they see it, and it's asynchronous communication. All writing is asynchronous. Money is what you do at the market. Instead of swapping potatoes for beans, you go and you sell your potatoes to someone and they give you money. And the money is an asynchronous storage form of value. And then you use it in the future. You take the money, and if the economy hasn't crashed and people still believe in this piece of paper that you have in your hands, you can exchange it for beans. Wanted posters, asynchronous. Post boxes, mailboxes. Imagine, there was a time when we didn't have mailboxes. Imagine if you had the idea of inventing a mailbox and you patented it, and you got like 1 cent every time someone put a mailbox up in front of their house. It's asynchronous. It's asynchronous delivery. Ironically, you can pay more to have the FedEx person come and get a signature and make sure you're at home. It costs a lot more and it fails often, especially in Berlin, because you're not home and then they leave it 2 kilometers away in a DHL pickup station. Music like this, these things are new, even though that looks old. All of these forms of recorded, videos and audio and so on, it's all asynchronous delivery of information. I read a story by Balzac some years ago, and he was saying he'd been to a concert and he'd been listening to the wonderful voice of the soprano or whatever, and saying it's such a tragedy that all of the other people on earth who weren't at the concert could not hear how great this sound was. And I was thinking, wow, things have changed. Books, obviously. Okay, food, that's a silo. We're very good, and we invented agriculture and so on, and we took our surplus and we put it somewhere and we use it in the future. It hasn't always been the case. So if you think about like the Great Potato Famine in Ireland, where 1 million people died because they ran out of food. That wasn't very long ago. That was like 1847 or something like that. And not only do we do it, but animals do it. So squirrels, they hide nuts, then they go and find them in the winter. Birds are famous for hiding seeds, in thousands of locations, and they can remember them all. And then they go back and they get the seeds. This is asynchronous behavior. Dogs, it's leaving a message on a lamp pole or some kind of pole or a bush. At some point in the future, another dog will come along and smell it, and there's a message there. This is asynchronous communication. Okay, so if you think about asynchronous systems, what's needed to be asynchronous. And the thing that you need storage. Because if you have the opportunity to do something now, but you want to do it in the future, even if it's in 10 milliseconds or 10 years, you've got to take something and put it into storage so it's available to you in the future. When I say storage, I'm talking in a very abstract sense. I'm going to come to many examples. So you've got to put something into the storage, and then you've got to be able to get it out. And that means that the storage has to have holes in it. It's got to have some form of access. You've got to be able to put things in, and you've got to be able to get them out. And I also call this packaging. That's why my title was talking about packaging. So if you want to be asynchronous, you need storage. That's like a fundamental thing. You can't be asynchronous if you don't have storage, unless the opportunity that you've got is something that comes along all the time. And in that case, you wouldn't think about storing it so you could use it in the future, because it's going to be available in the future anyway. Okay, so this is the first thing, which is very important. If you want to be asynchronous, you need storage. And there's many varieties. Well, sorry, there's several varieties of storage that I, at a high level. First of all, with the dog pissing on the post, the storage is basically free. It's already there. The dog just does it. It doesn't have to build it. It doesn't have to do anything. It just lifts up its leg and pisses on the grass or a bush or a pole. It doesn't matter. Sometimes the storage already exists, but you just have to find it, like with a squirrel, hiding things in a hole in a tree, or a bird hiding things, and so on. But in most cases, in the bottom sense here, you've got to figure out how to build it, or get lucky in some way, because I'll come back to that. And then you've got to build the storage, and then you've got to maintain it. And there's many examples. The picture on the bottom right is of a walled city. In a way, it's storage. They put stuff inside the walls. They have holes in the walls. And also, one thing to think about is, if you build a package, if you're able to build a package, what should you put in the package? And the answer is that you should put stuff which is rare in some sense, because things that aren't rare, you don't need to put them in the package because they're always available. So if you build a package, you put stuff in that is not going to always be available. You want it in the future. And if you think about cities, there's a lot of things that we put inside of city walls, and we close the walls. Sometimes we open them, we let the waste go out, and so on and so forth. And storage is extremely diverse. There's an incredible number of ways in which we humans use storage. We store things all the time. And I don't know if anyone else in the room thinks about this stuff the way I do, but I look around and I see storage everywhere. Like on Jules's arm, she's got tattoos. That's the form of storage of something. It's a graphical thing. She can show it to people in the future. She can look at it. She can be happy about her tattoos. You can put things in clay. You can draw with your finger in wet cement. You can carve your boyfriend or your girlfriend's name in a tree with a penknife. You can write books. You can do all sorts of things. All of these things are forms of storage. And the reason we do it is because we want to use that information in the future. Post-it notes are a great example. I gave a talk once about Post-it notes. I think Post-it notes are fantastic. And the reason that they're blank is because you can write anything on them. But more importantly, in a way, the reason that they're sticky is that you can put them in the place where you anticipate that in the future, the information on the Post-it note is going to be most valuable. That's why Post-it notes are sticky. Post-it notes are great. Okay, and in addition to there being many forms of storage, there's even more forms of reading and writing the storage, of input and output. Because for every one of those forms of storage, there's many ways in which you could actually do it. And this is all human stuff that I'm talking about. This is before we start talking about biology. Well, humans are biology. I don't mean to commit my own sin. Okay, so here's a summary of asynchronous versus synchronous stuff. When you have a synchronous thing, a lot of time can be spent waiting. It puts hard time constraints on everybody. Everyone has to be in the same place, has to do things at the same time. It consumes resources that may not be available later. And with asynchronous systems, if we can dream them up and we can implement them, then they're generally much better. Many of those examples that I talked to you about, They made people rich. Like think about Netflix, or think about whatever, like who invented the mailbox, or the video cassette recorder, or the phone, the phone voicemail system that records messages when you're out of your house. And actually, many of these things that are asynchronous, that we take for granted, they're actually extremely recent. Like television, even though television used to be synchronous, or records or movies and so on that you can watch on a DVD player. Those inventions are extremely recent. We've only just figured out how to store information in that way and play it back to ourselves when we feel like it. But we take it for granted. But actually we, as biological creatures, we are doing the asynchronous trick. And we're so advanced in some way that we can do these things now. And some of us are so young that you just think it's normal. But actually it's not normal at all. Okay, and there's many things we still do badly. Okay, so this is the end of the first act of the talk. And maybe this gives you a way to look at the world or to think about things. I don't know. You could ask yourself, what things do you regularly wait for? Like you're waiting for the end of my talk or the end of the introduction, or this example on the right, which I find it's really a nice example because it's a partial solution to waiting in line outside of a restaurant. They give you a buzzer, and then you can walk away, you can do other things. You don't have to stand in line, and then you've got to come back. But it's not a complete solution because you're still waiting in some way. And if you think about things that you wait for, then maybe you can think about how you could make them asynchronous and get rich. Okay, so here comes Act 2, which is, I think, of as sort of going down the rabbit hole of the rest of biology. And I think that this asynchronous principle or whatever, followed by the evolution of packaging, has occurred at every level in biology. And when I say every level, I really mean every single level, starting from the origin of life. And I'm not an expert on the origin of life by any means. I'm not an expert on anything. Okay, so I've been trying to learn a little bit about this subject and about biochemistry and so on. And there are different theories about the origin of life, but the one that I think is the most compelling, and maybe the one that fits the best with the way I think about things, it turns out that there's a theory that life got going in undersea vents, and not these things that were first discovered, which are called black smokers, but actual other vents that are highly alkali. They're also hot, not as hot as the black smokers. How many people have heard of this thinking or this sort of theory? Yeah. Okay. So I won't say too much because I'm like I said, I'm not an expert, but there's good reason to believe, I think, that cellular life got going at the bottom of the ocean, or at least underwater, near these vents. And there's multiple reasons why this makes sense. And there's like half a dozen characteristics of these physical situations that match very nicely with what happens in our cells. And one of them is that, it's too bad Boris is not here, but one of them is that you get heated, what used to be seawater that has subsided into the mantle, that boils and that comes back up, and that interacts with the water from the ocean, which is above, which is acidic, and you have this sort of boundary where you have this very alkali water coming from the bottom meeting a relatively acidic ocean, and you have a frontier between these two liquids, and you have these like liquid phase interactions, and it makes little bubbles, and the little bubbles are about the same size as a cell, and there's millions or billions of them, and they have these sort of iron sulfide membranes, and they have some free radicals of different kinds that are necessary for some things, like for example for reverse transcriptase, and there's a bunch of other characteristics that are consistent with biological cells, including mineral catalysts, which still exist in enzymes today and are still fundamental. There's a proton gradient, a primitive one, which I'm going to talk about more. There's conductance of electrons, as we have in the respiratory chain, and also very important. You have local physical concentration, which is something which is missing in other scenarios about the origin of life. It's like if life evolved in a puddle, in a warm puddle somewhere, and there was an RNA world, why didn't it all just float away? Why? What would keep it all together? Why? There's no reason for it to stick together. So there are these very nice properties of these systems. There's a book which is mentioned at the bottom, which I've told everyone about many times, and quite a few of you have read it. I've given some of you copies, and then I took it back, by the way. It's called Power, Sex, and Suicide. This is where I learned about some of these things, and then it was the starting point for me. Okay, so what do you need next? Like if this is where life got going, what do you need to do to carry on? One is that you need to make the proton pumping better, and you need some way to store energy. This is another problem with the RNA world hypothesis, is that there's no form of energy. There's no consistent form of energy that could fuel an RNA world of like self-replicating RNA molecules. It's a big missing piece out of that sort of primordial soup of RNA, and so that's very important. And you need biological membranes somehow to evolve from mineral ones. So obviously you've got to figure out how to make membranes. And one thing which I think is really interesting and sort of profound that I also learned from one of Nick Lane's books is that the membranes in bacteria and archaea are totally different. Everything's different. And there's like half a dozen ways in which they're just fundamentally different things, even though they're both, lipid bilayer membranes and they have the similar kinds of properties. They're made up of different things. They've got different bonds. They're made by different genes. They're totally different. So you could think that the evolution of making biological membranes, it happened after the split from archaea and bacteria. Anyway, and these autonomous cells which are somehow coming into existence, they have to free themselves from this environment, from this alkali vents under the sea, and they've got to drift away, because as we know, they ended up on land. Okay, I'm going to try and hurry up because it's already 29 past. So one of the things that happens in mitochondria, and it also happens with photosynthesis, is that you've got what's called proton pumping, which means that you have the respiratory chain, and as electrons get passed down the chain, protons get pumped into the storage compartment, as I would call it, between the two membranes of the mitochondria. And you have a build-up of a proton gradient between these two layers, or between this space and the inner space of the mitochondrion, and that pressure can drive the ATP synthase, which is this little motor here, and cause it to spin around, and that allows this thing to put phosphate groups onto ADP and make ATP, which is like the currency of energy, if you like. This is like the fundamental proton pumping like this is a fundamental characteristic of life. Bacteria do it. It happens in photosynthesis. It happens in all eukaryotic cells. It's more primitive, basically, than anything, except membranes. And this is a storage mechanism. It's actually a storage mechanism in two ways, because you have an area between the two membranes where you're pumping protons and you're building up a concentration, you're building up a gradient, you're storing protons in a particular case, and you don't store them for very long, because as the pressure builds up, or as the gradient builds up, you use it to drive that ATP synthase around, and it makes an ATP molecule, and the pressure goes down a little bit. But there's a storage component there that it doesn't last very long. And the second one is that you make an ATP molecule, and that molecule holds energy because of that third phosphate group which is on the molecule, and you can release that energy with hydrolysis by cutting off the third phosphate later on. And the ATP molecules, they last for a few hours. So that's also like asynchronous storage of energy in this case. And ATP is even cooler than that because you can move it around. You can make a package which has got energy in it, and you can move it. You can take that energy, you can use it somewhere else. And the membrane, as I said before, you need holes. And the membrane in mitochondria, in the inner membrane, that's why I sent that mail today about inner membrane. I couldn't resist. It's got holes. It's got these transport proteins where ADP can come in, phosphate can come in, and when you make ATP, it can come out. So there are holes that regulate the traffic in and out of the package. Okay, so these are kind of the fundamental steps at the origin of life. You've got to figure out how to make membranes. Then you use them to store potential and chemical energy via proton pumping and something like ATP. And you use that stored energy to thwart. Do you know the word thwart? It's like trick or defy or something rather. The second law of thermodynamics. Because you have to deal with the second law of thermodynamics because otherwise everything falls apart. That's what it says. Entropy increases, everything basically falls apart. In order to do that, you need energy. You've got to take energy from outside of the system in a way and use it to keep the system intact. And you use that stored energy to package other information like RNA and DNA. And once you can get that far, then you can take care of other things like replication. The packaging can evolve in many ways. You can get complexity, whatever that is. Okay, so I want to quickly just say a word about thermodynamics because it's super important. There was a very famous German physicist called Erwin Schrödinger, who you've probably heard of, and he probably wouldn't like being on a slide with John Travolta, but he wrote a book which is called What is Life? I'm not going to read this little section, but it's a wonderful book. It's written, I think, in 1944. Is that right? Yeah. Long before they knew about DNA and the structure of DNA, and that DNA was carrying the hereditary information. And he figured all this stuff out. It's really extraordinary. If you like the history of science, you could read it. It's fantastic. Anyway, you've got to pay the piper, as they say in English. You've got to pay the bill. So how can you? If you can make membranes, how can you hold them together? How can you keep doing what you've already built? Why does the system not fall apart? Well, you've got to spend some of the energy that you're storing on keeping your system intact. So in a way, the system is bootstrapping because you figured out how to make an energy storage mechanism in ATP and with membranes and proton pumping and so on. But if you don't put energy into keeping that thing going and intact, it will fall apart. So the first trick is to be able to store enough energy in a useful form that you can actually keep the system that you built together. Before you even think about replication and stuff like that, you've got to bootstrap yourself to the point where you've got enough energy to even keep going. Okay, so this is super important. Being asynchronous does not come for free. You've got to think of a way to make the storage. In the case of life, we just got lucky. With these bubbles at the bottom of the ocean, we got many of the things that we needed just for free. But you've got to come up with a way to do it. Then you've got to build it, which costs energy, and then you have to maintain it. Okay, it's going quickly now. There's more low-level steps that happened in the origin of life. Obviously, there's the invention of RNA, but RNA molecules, it's not so hard to get RNA molecules. You can maybe find them on asteroids, or you can make them in a test tube. You want DNA genomes, which is a form of memory. It's a way of remembering, in a sense, a bunch of RNA molecules or RNA sequences or whatever that, if you turn them into proteins, can work in some cooperative way to make a functioning unit. Photosynthesis is invented. There's symbiosis, as you all know. And then you have things like a cell with a nucleus, and the nucleus there's a membrane, and it's got holes in it, so you can get things in and out and so on. And then you also have memory, and memory sometimes resides in a brain. Okay, so if you've got packaging, like if you can do packaging, things are not going to stand still. There's many things that you can expect would happen if you can build packages. And we know what those things are because we, humans, have a lot of experience in making packages and then improving them. And if you look at the kinds of things that we've done to packages, you can see the same kinds of things have gone on in biology. So faster I/O, like faster input-output, you want to move storage around, like moving ATP and so on, or moving paper money or food. You want to use the storage for memory and communication, or you can. You can pass the package on to other people or other cells or whatever. You can put other things into your package. That's really what I mean. That's really symbiosis. You can make backups. That's what we do. We make backups of our own packages of information. And you can change the representation. You can do compression and so on. So there's many things that you would expect to have happen if you had a system where you could build packages and you let it evolve. And the kinds of things that we've done are the kinds of things that have happened in lower levels of biology. So for example, with faster input and output, there's many examples from biology. All of these things on the screen, they're all ways of being faster than just waiting for mutations to pop up in your DNA that happen to give you an advantage and that happen to be noticed by selection and that happen to survive and reach saturation or whatever. So there's 8 or 9 of them on the screen. I'm not going to read them because you can all read, but all of these things are examples of making the I/O faster. This is mainly about storage of information. How can you store the information? How can you write it more quickly? How can you get it out more quickly? How can you update it more quickly? All of these things, which are the things that we do in the technological world, biology has done these things too. Memory is also very interesting. It only makes sense to remember something if it's going to be useful in the future. So if you're a fly and you're only going to live for 3 days, it doesn't make sense to have a brain and to remember something that happened if it's not going to happen again. But sometimes things do happen again, like I give another talk, and it's good to remember them because then if you know, then you can not come to the talk because it's, maybe there's selection consequences. So it makes sense to remember things if what you're remembering can be exposed to selection, and if there's a fitness consequence, it can be very advantageous. But you don't need a brain to remember things. And there's many, many examples of organisms or even cells that can remember things, at least temporarily. And I wrote down some examples of them here. Epigenetics is one that many people will be familiar with, or, for example, innate immune system training. You don't need an adaptive immune system with a memory of that kind. You can also remember through sort of histone modification. So there's a ton of ways of doing memory. You can kidnap other packages, as I mentioned, and the 2 famous examples, of course, are mitochondria and chloroplasts in plant cells. Very good idea. You've made a package, you're using it for something. Well, you're walking down the street, as you are sometimes, and you see something and you want it, so you stick it in your backpack. That's what we do. We put stuff into our packages all the time because the package is useful in general. You don't have to use it for what you originally built it for. Okay, so here we go. Conclusion. I'm not sure that there is a conclusion. I'm not even sure that all of this thinking is worth mentioning. It all feels really obvious to me now, and it doesn't seem to lead anywhere, unfortunately. Some years ago, actually last century, I had a lot of ideas about, I was thinking about information in the natural world, and it caused me to design a storage architecture computationally, and I built it, and I made a company about it, and I ran it for too many years. Actually, I ran it into the ground, and it all failed. But after some years of thinking about this and building the system, I realized that what I had built was a storage architecture that allowed asynchronous communication between different agents. And the agents in this case were applications, or the people who were using applications. And that what I had built actually was very powerful and interesting, but not in a way that I had been explicitly aware of when I started doing it. It took me years to realize this. And once I realized it, I started to see these parallels in biology. And then I started thinking and reading and so on. So what can you do? Well, look at your day-to-day life, think about what you wait for, think about how they could be changed. And if you do think about this stuff, I would love to hear what you think of. So that's sort of my conclusion. I don't really have thanks in some way, apart from thanking you for listening, and the people in the office who I've talked to over the years, on and off, like Tali. And thanks to Derek, who's been sort of my long-term intellectual buddy in some way. Daniel Dennett, who sadly died earlier this year, came to some talks I gave, and I emailed him quite a few times about this about this thinking. Nick Lane wrote these wonderful books, which I highly recommend. You can read about all sorts of stuff about biology, the best science books I've ever read. Yeah, so thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions. Jackson.
Okay. Yeah, super interesting. I guess one thing that comes to mind is if you think of, my question is, if you think of asynchronicity as a coherent trait, and if so, like are there certain environments that might favor selection of asynchronicity or not, also at different scales of biology? Or do you think it's appropriate to label it all under the same umbrella, or I don't know?
Yeah, I don't think of it as a trait in a sense. That's why I sort of called it a principle. It's sort of it's a thing that kind of exists already, and if you can stumble upon it or do it deliberately as a human, it tends to work out very well. But of course, evolution doesn't have any anticipation of these things, and so is that a good answer? Maybe not. I don't think of it as a trait.
Okay.
Yeah, Nicholas.
Maybe a bit of a provocative question, but do you think your whole theory that you're building up adds any explanatory power to biology, or is it just something for informaticians to make it easier?
Yeah, no, I don't think it adds anything. I think it kind of pervades the whole of biology. It's what life is about, in a sense. Life is, all of the energy and all this stuff. It is in support of being asynchronous and being able to store energy and use it to live and to function. And so for me, all of this thinking, it's just a perspective. And there's different perspectives on biology. And that's why I say I'm not sure it's even worth mentioning, because it doesn't add anything in a way. You can't do anything with it. It's just like, oh yeah, I never thought about things that way. But maybe it's useful to someone, I don't know. If you want to make a startup company, it's a very good idea. But if you want to understand the origin of life, it's like, okay, who cares? I don't know. Anyway, all this stuff now feels very obvious to me, but it didn't, 5 or 10 years ago at all. This was just coming into my head. Okay, well, I'm surprised to even get 2 questions, but I'm not surprised who they came from. So anyway, thank you, and see you next week.